My name's Kirsty Winter and I'm the Section Manager for Industry Engagement here at CASA. And you may have run into most of my team, hopefully many of you have, as part of your engagements with the Aviation Safety Advisors, either through the webinars on the Pilot Safety Hub or through our AB Safety seminars, or you may have seen them out and about when they come to an airfield near you. Now, before we get started, I just want to talk about our digital badges. Now, we have partnered with Credly, and some of you may have seen these digital badges on social media and those sorts of things before. So it's a recognition of the fact that you've been involved in these safety education seminars and those sorts of things. It can be used on signature blocks, it can be used on your resumes and on various types of social media. So to become eligible for that, all you need to do is obviously stay until the end of the webinar, and then Credly will be in contact with you to see whether you'd like to actually use that digital badge. So today's webinar, we're talking about cracking the code. So we're going to be covering off on a couple of different topics. So first of all, we're going to review a little bit of the alternate criteria, just letting you know where to find that information. And we're going to look at aerodrome forecasts, the validity of those forecasts. We're going to talk about probs, and you may have seen them on the forecast that you guys have reviewed with regard to prob 30s and those sorts of things. We're going to talk a little bit about shallow fog and why that's maybe a little bit different when we look at forecasts. We're going to look at inters and tempos and what that means for us as pilots, especially in regard to things like fuel or alternate requirements. And then we're going to cover off on a little bit of from and becoming periods that you might see. All right, so let's kick off, and everybody loves to talk about regulations to start off with. Most people come to us and sort of say, why isn't the forecasts or the weather written in plain English? And it really comes back to the fact that we talk weather the same way across the world. So it's almost its own unique language that all pilots around the world are actually using from that perspective. So it almost comes back to ICAO requirements. Now, if we had to write it all in plain English, one, I'm sure Tim might jump in here with regard to what it may mean for the forecasters, but we'd probably be reading reams and reams and reams of paper just to determine one little bit of information with regard to our forecast for a particular location. And Tim, what does it mean for you guys at the Bureau of Met?
Well, yeah, for us, it's following the ICAO rules, and yeah, to write 9,999 in plain language just for the visibility would be for someone who's doing 40 TAFs every 6 hours, it would be impossible.
Yeah, so it'd be quite onerous and a lot of information for us. But we all learn that same language when we all start to learn to fly, and it's just making sure that we continue to be familiar with it. So for those of you that may have been a little bit of time since you looked at some of those codes, you can find that information either in your VFRG, you can find it in the AIP, and obviously on the Bureau of Meteorology's websites. For those of you who haven't seen it, they have a brilliant education centre or knowledge centre on their webpage, and it gives you all sorts of information. It can even give you specifics on things like understanding weather, like thunderstorms or those sorts of things at your particular locations. Now, I said at the beginning of the webinar that we might touch on a little bit of alternate requirements. So weather plays into our requirements for having an alternate because it's our backup plan. It's our plan B. So where do we find that information? It's in our Part 91 Plain English Guide or in our CASAs, so Part 91 in the Manual of Standards. That's where the main portion of it is. But then we also replicate some of that information in AIP, so in the en route section, and also in the VFRG. Now, the main things that lead us as to why we maybe need weather alternates is understanding what are our VFR minimum requirements when we're out flying. So again, you'll find that in those same areas. Now, I'm just going to play you guys a little bit of a video in regard to reminding us all about what are those VMC criteria that we need. Now, this is going to cover off on mainly our fixed wing, but we are going to cover off on a little bit of what that also means for our rotary brethren as well.
Visual meteorological conditions. You cannot fly VFR in weather below visual meteorological conditions, or VMC. VMC describes your visibility and distance from cloud in a particular class of airspace. In A, C, E or G class airspace, you must be at least 1,000 feet from cloud vertically and 1,500 metres horizontally when you're above 10,000 AMSL. Your visibility must be at least 8,000 metres. Below 10,000 and above 3,000 AMSL, your distance from cloud is the same, but visibility must be at least 5,000 metres. In Class G, at or below whichever is higher, 3,000 feet AMSL or 1,000 feet AGL, you must be clear of cloud and in sight of ground or water. Different criteria apply to Class D and rotorcraft. Can't maintain VMC? Decide early. Don't be afraid to contact ATC. Don't press on.
Okay, and you'll see there, that was a bit of a link to our YouTube channel. We have plenty more videos on there that if you're interested in having a look at some of those. Now, I did make mention that was predominantly for our fixed wing counterparts, but for our rotary wing, we also have similar requirements with regard to VMC. And you'll find those in the VFRG and also in AIP. Now, it will also depend, just like the fixed wing aircraft, whether you are operating in the different types of airspace, whether it be Class G airspace or your Class D airspace, about what those requirements are, whether it's just clear of cloud or whether you actually have a requirement for distance from that perspective. Now, let's have a look at TAF validity periods. And Tim, feel free to jump in whenever you would like. But we have a requirement as pilots, it's our legal obligation to actually review weather before we go flying. So we must study authorised weather forecasts and reports for departure aerodromes, en route, the destination, and any planned alternate aerodromes to be used, as well as any other reasonable available weather information that's going to help us understand what we need to do for our flight. Now, if your weather forecast is outside the validity period before a flight, you must obtain and review new information before commencing the flight. And you'll see in that slide there, it talks about the validity of being at least 30 minutes before and 60 minutes after your planned estimated time of arrival. Now, you must also provide a suitable alternate aerodrome when the arrival at the destination will be during the currency period of or up to 30 minutes before the forecast commencement of the meteorological conditions, falling below that VFR alternate minimas that we talked about in the previous slides. Now, for aeroplanes by day or night, or for helicopters by night only, the cloud-based ceiling of 1,500 feet AGL, visibility of 8 kilometres, and when the aerodrome forecast is not available, then you must make provision for a suitable alternate that has an available forecast. Now, you can see on the slide here, it says you can depart without a forecast provided whether at your departure aerodrome is suitable for 60 minutes from departure, and you must have a forecast for 30 minutes from departure, otherwise you must return. All right, so let's move on. Tim, I've got a question for you in regard to TAFs. Now, we looked at TAFs and GAFs in our previous webinar series that we did back in October. Forecasts have a certain validity period. Now, TAFs and TAFs 3s are only valid for a very finite period. Why do TAFs only go for like a defined period, and what are those defined periods?
Well, we have 12-hour, 18, 24, 30-hour TAFs. It's largely to cater for customer demand, particularly international airports will need a longer TAF to cater for international flights. It's based on customer demand and what is paid for as to how long those validity periods are, designed to be the operational window, though we will provide a best guess if customers give us a call and seek something beyond the current validity period. But there's a lot of uncertainty as we get further out beyond the current forecast. So here we can see this is a 24-hour lead time example of 4 models. So we've got on the top left the European, on the top right the US, the Australian on the bottom left, and the bottom right, we've got the Japanese model. You can see with 24 hours lead time, they're all very similar. Mid-level trough over South Australia, a high to the south of Western Australia with a cold front approaching Tasmania, and a deep southerly up the East Australian coast. However, if we move out to a 7-day forecast, so just on the next slide, please, Kirsty. You can see that there's a lot more variation in the models. We have either a trough or a cold front crossing the bight, but there's also a deep low in the Japanese model, to a lesser extent the European model, to the west of the bight, and you can see extraordinary variation in the precipitation over Eastern Australia. For a place like Adelaide, it makes the difference between almost cloud on ground and Cabo K conditions, depending on which model is correct. So while public weather can do a probabilistic 0 to 1 millimetre rainfall out to 7 days, and maybe 50% in this case, as you can see, or even 75% with over half the models having precip. From an aviation point of view, we'd be leaning between Cabo K and almost broken on the ground. So yeah, our ability to do aviation forecasts beyond 30 hours or so is very limited.
Yeah, and I can only imagine, because obviously before we go on holidays, we go and check the weather for 7 days ahead, but it's very much different from when we're trying to model for that aviation requirement and the specifics of what we need to understand. So we talked a little bit before about the TAF and our TAF requirements with regard to that validity period and how long we need to know that information before we go flying, and even, you know, when the time period for even before we get to our destination and after. Now, there's obviously some requirements with that for what we are allowed to fly. So cloud, more than scattered, below the alternate minima. So for rotary in class C and D airspace, or fixed wing, that's 1,500 feet or below, or rotary in class G airspace, 1,000 feet below. You know, wind, so that's our headwind, crosswind, downwind components, exceeding the maximum permitted for, I suppose, the aircraft that we're actually flying. And then our visibility requirements, so less than the alternate minima. For fixed wing or rotary in class C and D airspace, that's less than 8 kilometres, or for rotary in class G airspace, we're looking at less than 3 kilometres. So, Tim, can you explain to us how do the aviation forecasters, you know, get to that probability? How do you get that information? Well, how do you forecast for a prob?
Well, we look at the climatology, the expected spatial extent of the phenomena, and the forecaster uncertainty. For example, if we're looking at just isolated thunderstorms, and often with isolated thunderstorms, we'll be looking at less than 25% of the area, we'd be expecting at any given point in that area to be less than 3 in 10 chance, or less than the PROB 30. However, we'll monitor the radar, we'll be looking at if they develop more than 25% of the area, then we'll up it to 30%. But climatology also plays a very large part in the likelihood of thunderstorms and also fog. So if we just move on to the next slide, please, Kirsty. So here we can see that on the left is the fog climatology of Canberra. On the right is the fog climatology of Sydney. In winter, as you can see, the fog probability for 2 months of the year is actually above 30% in Canberra. So essentially, we're looking for any situation that would favour fog in Canberra. We will be putting a prob or something stronger, like a alternate or a prob 40 or an alternate in there, as there may well be more than a 40% chance of fog. Whereas when we move further east towards Sydney, fog is far less likely. Sydney, for example, has only 5 fog events on average a year. So we're looking for clear skies, high moisture, light winds, but we're also looking for the favourable climatological conditions of a high over the Tasman Sea, fog to form up in Western Sydney, then roll down through Homebush all the way through to Sydney Airport. So often we won't put it on until we see more of these conditions like fog at Richmond met. For other phenomena like smoke, We use PROB to express our uncertainty in the thickness of the smoke. We have very little knowledge as to what the firefighters are doing, the particle density coming out of fires, but we do know the strong inversion will trap the smoke in the lowest levels. So we are looking at expressing that uncertainty with a PROB. So as well as climatology uncertainty, we're looking at weather situation that it would aid the formation of those phenomena.
Okay.
So,
just before we move on to fog, and I know you spoke about fog and your probability just then, and before we get into shallow fog, I've got a question in the chat here from Mark that says, what's the best way to get weather in flight? How much communication do you have with air traffic control, for example, Mark? Oh, sorry, Tim. Sorry,
yeah.
I was talking about Mark in the question, but I'm directing the question at you, Tim.
Well, we're regularly liaising with the towers on the ground to get observations, and also particularly when they want to question our forecast. We also have a national coordination centre, which is located with Air Services Australia, and they are in constant liaison with air traffic control. So yeah, that's essentially our main area there. We do also get pilots in flight who have communication capabilities to call us up.
So we just discussed in that last portion where we talked about probability, you talked about fog a little bit in there, and something that we do see occasionally come up on the forecast is this MIFG, so the shallow fog. Why is this phenomena actually called shallow fog and not just called fog?
Well, essentially, shallow fog usually will have an operational visibility still of 10 kilometres. It's trapped in the beneath a very strong inversion, usually in the bottom 2 metres of the atmosphere. So it should, as a pilot approaches, there should be clear visibility of the ground through this thin layer of fog. And it does occasionally, though, waft up and interfere with our visometer sensors. So we will put it on the TAF so that people are aware that as they see these visibility fluctuations, that yes, we're aware of them, but it's not not expected to produce any operational problems. So as you can see on this, these observations here for Canberra, the visibility is fluctuating very rapidly. However, as we have a webcam at Canberra, we could confirm in this instance that the fog was only very shallow. However, there is the risk, particularly around sunrise, that with a little heating, we will see that fog mist mix into a thin mist layer. So we do have a PROB mist there for a few hours around sunrise. However, we're not expecting visibility to drop below 2 kilometres, and 7 out of 10 times we'd expect the visibility to remain 10 kilometres.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about inters and tempos, because that's probably the thing that affects us the most when we're looking at our aviation forecasts. And before we go into this, I probably just want to touch on fuel a little bit, mainly because as soon as we see these keywords come up in our forecasts, it almost needs to ring alarm bells about it actually has a requirement for us in regard to whether it be alternates or fuel. Now, our CASA Plain English Guide, or our CASA Part 91, actually gives us direction about us requiring to carry sufficient fuel for our flight. And there are advisory circuits that also refer to this. So it also comes under Part 91, under those advisory circuits, and it explains these requirements quite clearly. Alternatively, if you'd like some base level information on this, you can refer to AIP or the VFRG to get this. But just as a reminder, now, as part of our flights, we're required to have our final reserve fuel for fixed wing aircraft. That's our 30 minutes during day VFR flights, or 20 minutes for our rotary day VFR flights. And that changes depending on whether it's night flying, all of those sorts of things as well. But we need to look at our forecast to make decisions for fuel required, to understand our calculations for any alternates or sufficient fuel for holding. So if our forecast has inter or tempo, we can plan for an alternate or carry sufficient holding fuel. For an inter, 30 minutes of holding, or for tempo, it's 60 minutes. Now, when forecasting for inters and tempos for periods, Tim, how do forecasters actually determine what is an inter or a tempo period that you are putting into that forecast?
Main ways we do it is we look at the spatial extent of the phenomena, the expected duration of the phenomena, and the movement speed of the phenomena. For example, we have stratiform phenomena like rain or drizzle that generally fairly gradual changes and generally over a large spatial extent, whereas we have cumuliform phenomena like showers or thunderstorms, which are generally have quite sharp discontinuities and often have good breaks between cells. So if we just move to the next slide, please, Kirsty. So here you can see from about 2 weeks ago, a rain band with embedded thunderstorms approaching Perth from the north. That, while it's moving quite quickly, is clearly going to last more than half an hour as it crosses the aerodrome area of responsibility. Whereas to the southeast, you can see some isolated to scattered showers developing. And as they approach Albany, there's much more significant breaks between the cells there. So they will be shorter lived and moving, more like an inter sort of situation. And if we just move to the next slide, here we have some fairly organised convection, so severe thunderstorms over northern New South Wales, whereas around Canberra and southwest of Sydney, you can see much more popcorn or pulse convection that has reasonable breaks between the cells that's developing, much smaller spatial extent as well. So as they move through, we'd expect shorter duration reductions in cloud and visibility. In general, and just once more the next slide, please, given the area of responsibility for the TAF is a radius of 5 nautical miles or soon to be 8 kilometres, the diameter of the area of responsibility is 10 nautical miles. So a cell of no dimensions will still take, moving at 10 knots will still take an hour to cross the aerodrome. So we have a critical speed that would take 20 knots to clear the aerodrome within half an hour. If it's moving slower than that, we know we need a tempo. Faster than that, we need an inter. A cell 5 nautical miles wide will have a critical speed of 30 knots. Similarly, 10 nautical miles will need to cross 20 nautical miles for the eastern edge and to enter the aerodrome, and then the western edge to clear the aerodrome. So we'll have a critical speed of 40 knots. While glancing cells will have a shorter duration as they cross the aerodrome, cells are generally bigger than the aerodrome area of responsibility. So we tend to assume that they will cross the aerodrome reference point, and really they need to pass near the aerodrome reference point for us to even measure the low cloud and visibility drops. So yeah, that's how we calculate the speed.
That's really good information for us as pilots, because it gives us that understanding about why we need that extra holding fuel or that alternate for consideration, because you're looking at that sort of wider area and how long that's potentially going to last in the area that we might be flying in. So as pilots, we must be aware that TAFs and TAFs 3 can be updated outside of the actual routine 6-hourly update period that we normally see. What causes us to see these amendments or updates coming from that perspective, Tim?
Well, we have a set of amendment criteria that our TAF must be correct to, and if we are seeing observations or we are expecting to see observations in the to differ from the current TAF, we will amend. For cloud, it's passing through the highest alternate minima or the heights listed in front of you. Similarly, visibility, passing through the highest alternate minima or the heights listed in front of you. We have wind direction, temperature, QNH, and significant weather criteria, and also turbulence. Any increase from slight to mod to SEV will require an amendment, though an easing will require an amendment down 2 slots. So yeah, SEV to slight would require an amendment. We keep the TAFs under constant review, both manually and automatically. Here you can see one of our TAF alerting tools, and in the Melbourne Aviation Centre, you can see which is WA South, South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. You can see that there's three what we call dots of shame that indicate that the automated observations have exceeded the amendment criteria. In this case, Carnarvon is an orange dot of shame, and from the legend to the bottom right of the screen, you can see that that means that there's wind amendment required. So we amended Carnarvon in this case for for the wind, as the sea breeze came on a little earlier. This was at 02 Zulu. However, we needed a closer inspection of what was going on at both Cooper Pedy and Narrandera. So we did a manual check of what the observations were. At Cooper Pedy, you can see that at 02Z, that the thunderstorms had already cleared through. The key as to when the lightning occurred is on the bottom left of the screen. So you can see that those cells are moving away. So for 02 Zulu, it was, it's fine to not have thunderstorms on the TAF, but it is alerting, as our alerting criteria is fairly generous at 30 nautical miles. So we like to keep an eye on those. Narrandera, however, the visometer was acting spuriously. So as you can see, the visometer was dropping down quite rapidly. Often we see these things, particularly in New South Wales West, when spider webs or the like get on our instruments and they just need a clean. So we schedule a clean when that occurs. We confirmed with the webcam that the visibility was crystal clear, left the TAF as CAV OK, and in this case issued a NOTAM for erroneous visibility data.
Okay, I've got a couple of people with their hands up for questions, but just before I go to those people with their hands up, that NOTAM that you had to put out for that amendment because of the discrepancy in information, that will be found obviously in the location NOTAM for that particular aerodrome?
Yes, through NAPES, it's clearly visible on the NOTAM page.
Okay, I've got a question here from Barry Fitzgerald. Barry, I believe I have allowed your mic. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Barry.
Actually, that's a bit of finger trouble because I was trying to write a message, but it's slightly, I'm bowling off outside off stump here, but I'll end up with a red face, I fear. But on page 80 of the VFRG, it refers to a TAF3 and an ICAO landing forecast. And I'm embarrassed to say I understand TAF3 and TAF, but I'm not too sure what an ICAO landing forecast is.
You've got me. I'm not familiar with the term ICAO landing forecast. I would have to imagine it is the TAF or TAF3.
How about we take that one on notice for you, Barry, and we'll come back to you with a response.
Thank you.
No worries. Was there somebody else with their hand up that I saw before? No, but I do have two different questions in the chat channel if you're happy to accept them now, Tim.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on the height, on what height is visibility determined?
The highest alternate minima. Well, that's the highest alternate that is listed for that particular aerodrome, or the highest visibility that's listed for that aerodrome. It's not the Bureau that determines that, I'm afraid. It might be Air Services Australia, I think.
All right. So we'll keep moving on for a moment. So we've just talked about some of those amendments that you saw that we had to put out the NOTAM for. Is that reflected in what we can see here as well?
In this case, a NOTAM was not put out because you can see on the Strawn data that there is 6 slashes that indicate that the data is currently unavailable. Similarly, the AWIS is correctly reporting that the data is currently unavailable. So in the case that the data is unavailable rather than erroneous, we don't put out a NOTAM. But yeah, as long as it's correctly reporting that it's unavailable, it will remain in the system and not be faulted.
Okay. All right, so we often see these also in our forecast is the from and the becoming periods. So what is the difference between a from period and a becoming period?
Well, from is a clear demarcation of a change. It's usually associated with a sharp discontinuity, like a cold front, for example, in this one here. But it's also used to point to minor variations of changes that don't hit our amendment criteria. For example, the onset of a sea breeze. In this case, you can see the cold front has moved through Hobart on the 21Z satellite image. We have a from in the TAF from 21Z of the wind swinging around south to southwesterly and increasing in speed. And you can see from the meteogram of the observations on the right that right on 21 Zulu, the winds came around southwesterly, became a lot stronger and also became gustier. So this is quite a good example of a sharp discontinuity that's characterised by a from. Becoming is more of a gradual change. Or it can also be used to express uncertainty. So if we could just move to the next slide. So in this case, you can see at Ballarat, we had cloud broken at around 300 feet, and over around a 2-hour period, it lifted above the highest alternate minima. So a becoming was used to express that transition, as opposed to having several from lines starting out with broken at 300, then from an hour later broken at 1,000, and then from an hour later above ham. So the becoming was used to express that gradual change. However, we do also use becomings to express our uncertainty if the timing of a change is not well known. So on the next slide, you can see this is our model guidance for Hobart for a cold front that's approaching. We have the European model on the top left and the Australian model on the right. You can see the timing of the change on Wednesday the 15th was around the 18Z mark on the European model. The Australian model on the right, though, it's more like the 16Z mark. So a becoming 16 to 18 was used on the 00Z TAF to express that uncertainty. However, as we move closer to the event, the models become more consistent. And you can see on the next slide that the timing range varies now between 17 and 18 Zulu, so the becoming can be shortened. And once the front actually starts to make landfall and we can determine its actual path on the radar, that can be further narrowed to a from to express our greater certainty in the timing of that change.
Okay, so the becoming period is almost like a warning period, I suppose, of a change that's going to occur during that period. So yes, to look at that period very carefully about what's coming afterwards.
Yes, or it could be a clearing as well, but the becoming expresses that the clearing or the deterioration will occur during that period, not at any given point in that period.
Okay, fabulous. Look, everybody, that sort of brings us to the end of our presentation side of things, and we'll open up now for some questions for Tim from the Bureau of Meteorology from some of the things that we've potentially covered today. Now, just to cover off on some of the things that we have looked at and just give you all a quick overview before we go to those questions. So we've looked very briefly at alternate minima and obviously some of our VMC criteria that we need to understand before we even go flying. We've looked at our validity periods of our forecast, that PROB side of things and how we come to a PROB, shallow fog and why that's a little bit different to standard fog when we see that on a forecast, inters and tempo periods, how that comes about, but also what it means for us with regard to alternates and our fuel requirements. And we've also looked at that from and becoming periods and how that becoming is almost like a bit of a tailored warning period that we need to be looking at. Now, I note down on the slide here, Tim, that we have the Bureau of Meteorology's phone number here. What other things should pilots consider with regard to getting in contact with the Bureau of Meteorology?
Well, as well as that generic number, there is on the bottom of each GAF the phone number for the person who produced that GAF and is producing all the TAFs within that GAF area. So you can get directly onto the forecaster who's looking after that area through that phone number. However, phone calls aren't our highest priority. Things like amending tasks for deteriorations, ditching reports, search and rescues, whatever, are a much higher priority than phone calls. While we'll try to answer every call, we may often ask you to call back at a less busy time because we can get hundreds of calls a day.
Okay, and so, but it is like if a pilot is struggling to understand something that is on the actual forecast, or they want to query something, they are able to actually contact the Bureau of Meteorology.
Absolutely. And
Fabulous.
realistically, the times we ask people to call back are usually only at handover around 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Most of the time you'll get through.
Okay, and I know before we came online today, you were telling me obviously today's a bit of a busy day in the Melbourne forecasting office today because of some of the weather deteriorations down in the southern part of Australia. Is that the sort of day where you might get that little bit of a delay in response for some of those phone calls that come through?
Yes, today's the sort of day that you might be asked to call back because a SIGMET is due in 10 minutes or the like, and we just need to get our products out before we can answer the questions.
Okay. Look, I will open up now the floor to everybody for any questions that they have. And I know there's a little bit of chat going on in the chat window at the moment, reference the question that we'd heard earlier from Barry. And we will come back to everybody with a response to that question after we've actually finished the webinar. And I note that someone's talking about TTFs. Yes, we don't have TTFs anymore. They are actually gone. Tim, can you talk a little bit about the changeover from TTFs?
Yes, we replaced TTF with TAF3. So those aerodromes are now receiving a TAF every 3 hours. However, the TAF is also a lot more responsive, particularly given there's a smaller holding period associated with it and no buffer period. You'll often find TAF3s involve FROMs that use our 10-minute window that we can put our timing on, and they will be amended very regularly. So we are often chasing the radar for TAF3s and treating them like they were a TTF for the first 3 hours of the product.
Okay. Do we have any other questions from our audience? So we've got one from Joe. On a GPWT forecast, is the valid time and date shown a valid from or a valid to time and date?
I believe it's a valid at. So it's point. I believe that's the gridded weather and temperature forecast. So
Correct.
Yeah, that is valid at 12 Zulu, for example. And the next chart would be valid at 00 Zulu. And so, yeah, allows interpolation between the two automated products.
Okay, Joe, hopefully that answered your question. I've also got one here from Lucas. Could you please explain what the criteria needs to be met for a specie to be issued?
Species largely follow our amendment criteria, so the visibility or cloud passing from any of those through any of those layers. So the highest alternate for that particular aerodrome, which obviously depends on the topography and obstructions around that aerodrome, as well as 1,500 feet, 1,000 feet, etc. Its rapid change in pressure will result in a specie. The winds varying by 30 degrees if the mean speed is above 15 knots. The gusts varying from the mean speed by 10 knots or more. Or will trigger a specie. Rapid changes in temperature and pressure will also trigger a specie, as will a change of present weather. So, yeah, essentially it follows our amendment criteria.
Right, great. Thanks, Lucas, and thanks, Tim, for that one. I've also got another one from Ashley. How interested are the Bureau of Meteorology in pilot reports for things like cloud tops and freezing levels? How different to the forecast would you like to get an update from pilots?
Well, certainly anything beyond 1,000 feet for freezing level would be very interesting. And similarly, anything below 10,000 feet that varies by 1,000 feet or more, as far as cloud tops would be very useful for us to know. other phenomena we'd love to get more pilot reports on are things like turbulence and icing, not just when it's unforecast, which is typically when we do receive the pilot reports, but also when it's forecast, so we can confirm our processes and say, okay, we're doing it okay with this one, we're not doing it okay with that one, and refine how we do our icing and turbulence forecasts. But yeah, pilot reports are always welcome.
Okay, great. And we've got two other questions here. So from Ajit, Ajit, you may need to provide us with a little bit more clarity to the question that you have put into the chat. Are those cloud ceiling distance and below same for student pilots? I read somewhere 600 metres. I'm not sure where you're coming from with that one, Ajit. I also have a question from Mark from earlier. So which service provider do you call in-flight weather updates? Radar. You can get automated ATIS AWIS if in range, but what is the correct RT for the procedure? Mark, I'm gathering that that question is in regard to the air traffic service provider. We just might need okay, I was going to say we just need a bit of clarity on that question. So obviously if you're talking to Tower, you're going to be asking Tower for an updated weather, but hopefully you won't need to do that because you would have already got the information from the ATIS as you're approaching that particular aerodrome. But in flight, it's going to depend on who you're actually talking to with regard to air traffic. So whether it's your en route sector, so your area frequency, or whether you're going to be talking to the approach controller because you're coming into a particular location. And Richard Rhymes is just asked for clarification from you, Mark, about do you access any airfield met data? Oh, sorry, Richard, are you asking that of Tim?
Okay.
Yep.
Yes, we're constantly accessing airfield met data. That's sort of our bread and butter, that we're constantly looking at the observations, as you saw on the examples earlier, that we're monitoring them both automatically and routinely checking them. Every time we write a TAF, we're reviewing everything that's happened at. Sorry, you mean not airports? If there's no automated weather station, no, we don't access that. You're based at Camden? Okay, welcome.
Okay, so Iman, I'm based at Camden. Every now and then in Cavo K, Bureau of Meteorology reports a speci auto with visibility below IFR, low IFR. This usually lasts about 15 minutes before a new METAR is issued with Cavo K. Curious as to see what the cause is.
Well, yeah, Camden is well known as a shallow fog hole. So potentially it could be shallow fogs, but it could well be anything from someone mowing the lawns nearby to a spider web on the sensor. We often get very brief fluctuations due to local effects or building works going on nearby. So yeah, it could be any of those if it's a completely spurious spurious reading. And if it's persistent, we will put out a NOTAM for it. If it's a one-off that it lasts a few minutes and then comes good again and we can verify that it seems to be behaving well, we'll generally leave it.
All right, fabulous. Look, everybody, we've come to probably the end of our allotted period for our webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's session, and thank you for the questions that have come through, and especially thank you to you, Tim, for providing all of this key information for all of us. We will take obviously some questions on notice and get back to you following the particular webinar. And just to remind everybody, at the beginning we talked about those little key little labels that we're able to give people, or recognition of participating in some of our safety webinars. So thank you very much for those that have actually stayed on for the entire period, and you'll be able to access that once Credly have actually been in contact with you with regard to getting your badge. Thank you for your participation again, and good afternoon.